Hey all, welcome. I'm the generation guy to keep my anonymity, and this is going to be the beginning of my process of explaining to you generations and how generations work, but also we're going to get into the meat of what this whole thing is going to be about, which is the Strauss Howe Generation theory, which I find really interesting. And more than anything, I just want to post something that I think is interesting and something that I would want to watch. So we wanted to get started on the right foot, and I feel like we have to have a little bit of a background and a basis of what we're talking about. So the first question we're going to ask is, what is a generation? For younger people, they may not understand what generation they belong to or what exactly makes up a generation. Maybe even older people are like, well, how do I really fit in my generation? And what is my generation? How did they decide that I was in this generation? Do I have to be a part of this generation? These are all legitimate questions that hopefully will get answered. So the first thing, a generation is all of the people born and living about the same time. And that's very vague. How is that determined? Who decides that? So one of the places that I used to gather information was a Pew Research, which is online, and I'll provide a link to that below. And you can go check that out if you want a really long read about generations. So they use two main factors to determine what your generation is. One, they're going to look at where are you in life. Are you a child, teenager? Are you your 20s, mid-30s? Are you middle-aged? Are you a retiree? That's going to be the first thing that they look at. And that's a small part of the equation. A much larger part of the equation is the people that were born around the time that you were born. Maybe the people born before you, be the people born after you, but they're going to look at that group of people. The reason they look at that is they are assuming that you've had a lot of similar experiences growing up that have shaped the person that you are at this time. And so they're going to look at the demographics you grew up with, attitudes, historical events that happened while you were maturing or growing up. You know, once again, we talk about those 4 life cycle times, right? Or where you are in your life. When you were a child, how did that specific historical event affect you and the people around you that were the same age? That's how they determine that. Now, I want to point this out. They also look at the prevailing sentiment among other people looking at generations and how those generations fit together. So don't think of this as a hard and fast rule. Like if you were born on this year in, say, 1981, then you are most definitely this generation. I don't think that totally applies. I think there's some wiggle room there. Full disclosure, I'm from Idaho, right? And things move a little bit slower. I'd say that we have to set our clocks back about 3 years, especially growing up. Not so much now. Our information has definitely improved the speed at which we gather it. But as a kid, I definitely felt behind. So I don't think these are hard and fast rules in terms of what a generation is, but it does give us guidelines, and it's a great basis point. So what does this all mean? How does this work for us? Does this mean that we're all exactly the same if we're born in the same generation? We all think the same and act the same and process information the same?
Me. Me too.
I don't think so. I don't think that's how it is. But that's just me. Maybe we are and we just don't realize it. Maybe the simulation that we're in is a really good one. It's tactile and you can understand how everything works, and they've just programmed it so that's how we are and we're all exactly the same. Don't really think that's how it is. So I still firmly believe that we are the gatekeepers of our own destiny, right? We get to choose how we process experiences and how we go through them. And everyone is going to process experiences differently. They could be minor experiences, but the one thing being in a generation does, and we talked about your cycles of life, it guarantees that during a certain cycle of life, you experience the events together. And generally on really big events, people process those experiences somewhat similarly. Just to give you some examples, I mean, you have the Great Depression, World War II, Vietnam, Challenger spaceship explosion, September 11th attacks, the Great Recession, the Cubs winning the World Series. I mean, these are major, major events that happened in our lifetimes, right? And so what I want to do now is just give you a basic rundown of the generations that we're going to be covering in this. And I've limited it to 6. We'll probably talk about some of the generations that happened before these 6, just for context, especially when we start to get into all the information that this generation theory has to give us. So here are your 6 generations that we will learn about. First is the Greatest Generation from 1900 to 1924. Silent Generation, 1925 to 1945. The Baby Boomer Generation, 1946 to 1965. Generation X, 1965 to 1979. The Millennials, 1980 to 2000. And finally, the Zoomer Generation, Generation Z. They don't really have a name for it, probably the youngest generation, 2001 until 2013. They don't really know. They're still determining this and trying to get a consensus. So as we explore this world, we're going to start to understand how these times in your life and the experiences you have during those times are connected according to this generational theory. How they work together to create a basic roadmap of how your life will proceed, and because it proceeds that way, how you are going to perceive the world and be perceived by the world. It's a very interesting theory that our trajectory is a circle, and we're kind of going around in a circle, and we're rinsing, repeating, doing it over again, and hopefully this helps us understand the world around us, what's happened, what's going to happen, and what we can expect in the future. And that's why I find this theory, and I want to stress that, this theory so interesting, is because maybe it gives us a roadmap to be prepared for what's ahead of us and to understand what's happened to us and why we are the way that we are. So, next episode, we'll be talking about the Strauss Howe Generation theory in detail and how it works. And we'll be really hitting on some major points of that. Until then, continue to be the gatekeeper of your own destiny.